Hi everybody, welcome to Corrections for Juveniles, which is chapter 17 in our text. In 2014, this is the year the book uses for its statistics, for most of the statistics. In 2014, 667 juveniles were arrested for homicide, 7,500 for rape, and over 26,000 for assault. These feel like really high numbers, but compared to the adult population, they're actually very low. Extreme juvenile crime is rare, and since 2005, it's dropped over 60%. But Americans still believe juvenile crime is a big problem. Why do you think that is? Well, generally speaking, whatever we're afraid of, whatever scares us, is what the news focuses on because they're trying to sell something. And so when juveniles commit a crime, it shocks us, especially as adults who have raised children, it shocks us to the point where it catches our attention. So it is blown out of proportion, made bigger than it really is statistically in regards to crime overall, right? So the historical juvenile corrections, in the 1600s, they came up with the term parens patriae. I always struggle with that. Parens patriae, which literally translates to parent of the nation. It allowed governments to step in. The government of England, which is the crown, it's called the crown because of the monarchy in England, to step in and take control of children, right? So, and these were vagrant and delinquent children. So anyone that was caught in any sort of crime, petty theft, whatever, they would take them and send them to poorhouses or workhouses, right? Orphan children as well. But the conditions in these places were really, really bad. So in the 1800s, the reform movement began, and that was John Howard. And John Howard is the same John Howard who initiated correctional reform in England around the same time, so in the 1800s. And so the reform movement began, and they tried to move these children out of the poorhouses and the workhouses. Or in some cases, they strictly just tried to clean them up, right? So you'll see in a lot of historical fiction, some classic fiction like Charles Dickens, for the most part, he describes these conditions that the children lived in, and this is what John Howard was trying to change, right? Going to the United States, our juvenile corrections, the Puritan period is, before the United States was formed. Children were evil and needed discipline was the thought of the day, was the belief of the time, right? And this is the same period of time where, young children were accusing other children and other adults of being witches, right? The Salem witch trials were around the same time, and they were believed because it was believed that children were evil, and that the only salvation for children was to teach them about God and give them strict discipline. So the Puritan period lasted was mostly in the 17th century, the 1600s, right? So it led into the refugee period, where children were believed to be able to learn good, right? But they had to be in a healthy environment, and they still required discipline. In the 1800s, we came up with the juvenile courts. Juvenile court was originated in Cook County, Illinois, which is the county that is in which contains the city of Chicago, right? So the court took a role of parent. Once again, we have this idea of parens patriae, right? So the courts would step in for the parent, but not only for parents who did wrong, who were delinquent, but also those who were neglected or abused, right? So the court sometimes, this is the first time that the court stepped in when a child hadn't done anything wrong, they were just not being treated right. So that happened in the late 1800s. The juvenile rights era started in the 1960s. The same reform era that hit the prison system of the United States in the 1960s also hit the juvenile rights system, right? The ACLU filed lawsuits on behalf. And for the first time, the Supreme Court extended constitutional rights to juveniles. Until this time, juveniles that were taken into custody didn't really have any rights. They weren't allowed to, they could self-incriminate, they could be searched without any warrants. And there were some really horrific stories. One of the more famous ones was called the Scottsboro Boys, right? Scottsboro Boys were these young African-American youth who were accused of the crime of rape by two girls. It's a famous story. I'll leave you to do some research on it, and you'll see that this is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court, many years later, of course, stepped in and started to empower the juvenile courts and empower juveniles with constitutional rights. The crime control era started the late 60s into the early 70s, and that was when public opinion came to believe that the courts were too lenient on juveniles, right? They believed that this whole juvenile rights era had made it even easier for children to commit crimes. Now, there is no statistical evidence that that was true. It simply became it coincided with the advent of major media, with the advent of television, where the things that people did wrong could be broadcast to the world, and very often it was something that shocked us, right? Something that we believed that caught our attention, and so it kind of got blown out of proportion and led to the crime control era, where they decided that many states, many cities, many courts decided we needed to start punishing children more like adults because they are committing the same offenses, and if they're committing the same offenses, they should be treated the same. And we're going to get over here as to why that was a bad idea. And in the era that we're in now is the evidence-based era of juvenile corrections, right? And with the evidence-based corrections basically says is that any program, anything that you're going to do in the correctional system, the juvenile correctional system, must be evidence-based. It must be supported by scientific research. That is a phenomenon that has kind of embraced the criminal justice system as a whole, but it started more in the juvenile justice system than anything else. So that's one of those things where they've recognized that locking kids in prisons, even juvenile prisons, is something that isn't really good, and it's not going to help them to stop offending. And so we find that they raise the age. That has happened in New York in the last few years, where they will not put these children into these states of incarceration anymore or bring them to adult courts anymore, is part of the result of the evidence-based era of juvenile corrections. So, why treat juveniles differently, right? You know, we talked about how we went through these eras where in the 1960s they recognized that juveniles had constitutional rights, and then into the 70s where there was this belief that they were being treated too leniently, and so they started to be treated more like adults and brought them to adult courts and adult prisons even. And so, you know, now the evidence-based era is starting to recognize that there are a few reasons why juveniles should be treated differently, right? First of all, the brains are not fully developed. The most recent research says that adult male brains do not fully form or not fully developed until the mid to late 20s, right? So between the ages of like 25 and 28. Women is slightly earlier, so they can develop as soon as 23 to 26 years age. But still, when you're talking about teenagers, when we're talking about juveniles, we're generally talking about teenagers, certainly people under the age of 18. We're talking about how they're committing crimes, but their brains will not be fully developed for maybe 8 to 10 years. They are more susceptible to treatment, and what that means is that the programs that we've talked about in the adult correctional facilities that don't have a huge success rate are much more successful in children when applied to children, right? Because their families can still influence them. Their families, their mother, their father, their grandmother, sister, brothers, they still influence them, and they still have an impact on them and can help to divert them away from offending. Most juvenile crime is committed in groups, right? And I'm not talking about gang crime. Gang crime is something that's separate, right? This is crime that's committed in groups. You get into mischief together. A bunch of teenagers hang out together. They get bored. Maybe they decide to start drinking. Maybe they decide to start breaking car windows. Whatever they're going to do, they're doing these things as dares on each other or try to impress each other because they are easily influenced by their peers, right? But something that's important to remember about juveniles and teenagers in general is they don't understand the consequences of their actions, right? They don't understand. They have no experience to know that there are repercussions for these things. They have no perspective to understand that there are repercussions to these things. And the repercussions that they hear about are not real for them, right? They're only concerned about what's happening in front of them. They can't see far enough into the future to realize that if they get into a big fight and they seriously hurt someone, they're going to go to jail for it, right? They don't have the perspective. The consequences aren't real to them. Delinquency, right? Some facts about delinquency is not well understood. Why children commit crimes, they don't even know half the time themselves why they've done something, right? It's not well understood. It is also quite common for teenagers to engage in behavior that if they were adults would be considered criminal, and that is something maybe as simple as breaking a window, right? That's called criminal mischief in New York State. If a juvenile does it, somebody under the age of 18, it's a delinquency, right? But they don't understand that that's a crime that can have consequences, can land you in court or in jail. There is no consensus on what normal teenage behavior is. People that study delinquency recognize that behavior that would be considered criminal in adults is very common, and it should be considered normal behavior. People who do not engage in those things or who grow out of those things, maybe have great memories, think that shouldn't be considered normal, even if they did it themselves, right? And then you have the idea of status offenses, right? Status offenses are essentially things that juveniles can get in trouble for, they can be labeled delinquents, that are strictly based on age. So think about that. That is things like driving the car, smoking, drinking, and there is a lot of thought, and there's a lot of evidence, and there's a lot of proof that status offenses really don't make sense. Now, put it in perspective, right? So when you're 18 years old, you can vote. You can vote in an election and have a say in who the President of the United States is, but you can't drink. You can enter the Army, fight and kill or be killed, but you still can't drink. That's the type of thing where our status offenses don't make a lot of sense, right? You go to college, you're living on your own, you're still not allowed to drink. The juvenile justice corrections, our juvenile corrections system, right? So you get arrested. In 2015, 700,000 youth were arrested. That's 8.5% of the youth population were arrested. There are racial disparities. More youth of color are arrested than white youth or Asian youth. Girls, offenses by girls are increasing, and boys are decreasing, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Some people believe it's because of the fight for equality, right? You want to treat men and women, boys and girls more equally. So if you're going to treat them equally, you're going to treat them equally in all ways, which means you may end up arresting them if they do something wrong, right? The dispositions for juveniles, how juveniles are processed in court. So they go to get arrested, they get put in front of a court, and the first thing that can happen to them is they can get a waiver, which means they get transferred to juvenile court. So instead of going to adult court, they go to, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Instead of going to juvenile court, they go to adult court. They get waived to adult court, or they get diverted to juvenile court. That's the first thing that happens. 21% of the youth that are arrested are detained or held inside of a detention facility somewhere, 21%. And that's only at the start. We're only talking about how they brought into the system, they get detained. At adjudication is a preliminary hearing where they decide, hey, you know what, maybe we should let you out, maybe we should charge you formally, maybe we should reconsider the adult court. Those are all the possibilities that can happen with an adjudication. More than 50% are sentenced to probation after the adjudication, and that's community supervision, right? You're out in the streets, and somebody supervises you. Your parents, a counselor, you may have to go to treatment, but all of that is under supervision. In schools, juveniles are they're not formally put in probation, but they're put in schools, and they're kept in their schools and have to stay in their schools. And the idea of that is to reduce truancy, reduce school violence, and increase academic performance, to try to improve their academic performance. Now, sometimes the way they operate with juveniles in schools lead to what's called the school to prison pipeline. Extra credit again, 5 points on your final exam. If you can write up to 5 points on your final exam, write a one-page essay explaining what the school to prison pipeline is. All right? Incarceration. 22% after the entire system is done are incarcerated. They are imprisoned. They are sent to a place where they cannot leave. after their court hearing is done. 22% of all juveniles who end up in the correctional system end up being sentenced to some sort of detention. And that's the summary for juvenile corrections for juveniles. We have another one coming up, justice for immigrants. We'll be right back.